Sometimes pain doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It tiptoes dressed in the clothes of people you love, sits across the table from you, and asks for one more thing, just one more thing, until there's nothing left of you but the silence after a slammed door. If you've ever stood in a kitchen that once smelled of comfort and now carries the sting of betrayal, you'll understand why I'm telling this story. And if your heart has ever been bruised by the very hands you once held with pride, maybe you'll stay till the end, and maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little less alone. My name is Lorna. I'm 63 years old and I live in a small coastal town in Maine, in a house that still carries the scent of the lemon oil I used on the banister every Saturday for the past 27 years. I was a public school teacher for most of my life, second and third graders mostly, and when I retired, I thought I'd trade school bells for tea kettles, morning rushes for quiet sunrises. My husband Clark passed away 5 years ago after a brief but brutal illness, and I've been learning how to be a one-person home ever since. We had one child together. Her name is Camille. She was my whole universe for many, many years. Bright, opinionated, always 2 steps ahead of her classmates. She had a passion for art and an impatience for structure. I used to joke she'd either be the next Frida Kahlo or the CEO of a chaotic empire. Instead, she married Greg, a man with slick hair, a tight handshake, and a tendency to call me ma'am in a tone that made it feel like an insult. I never trusted him. There was something behind his smile that felt more like calculation than warmth. But Camille loved him, or she needed to believe she did. And I, like so many mothers, swallowed my concerns because I didn't want to lose her over my doubts. They lived about 40 minutes away, just far enough to make visits feel like errands and not casual pop-ins. Still, I saw them often. When they needed help painting a nursery, when they asked for a loan to cover an unexpected expense, when they needed someone to dog sit for their rescue poodle while they went on a wellness retreat. I gave what I could, sometimes more than I should have. Not because I was naive, but because love has a way of convincing you that it's noble to bleed quietly. The morning everything shifted was a Sunday. It was one of those late autumn mornings where the wind outside is loud, but the light through the windows is soft. I had just poured myself a cup of chamomile and was halfway through the crossword when the doorbell rang. Camille was standing there, in a camel-colored coat and ankle boots that looked too expensive for someone always between jobs. Her eyes were lined with frustration before she even opened her mouth. "Greg's waiting in the car," she said. "We just need a quick favor." I stepped aside and motioned her in. She didn't sit. She walked straight into the kitchen, set her oversized bag on the counter, and pulled out her phone like she was about to read a script. "We're booking a last-minute flight to Tampa. Greg has a pitch there tomorrow, and it's a huge opportunity. We don't have the cash flow to buy the tickets outright until next week, so I figured you could just use your card to cover it, and we'll pay you back before the billing cycle ends." I blinked, not in surprise. These requests weren't new, but in fatigue. My pension was modest. I had been quietly saving for home repairs, for a trip to Scotland Clark, and I never took. I had told Camille last month that I was trying to budget more carefully, but here she was again, asking as though I'd forgotten my own boundaries. "I'm sorry, Camille," I said gently. "I really can't this time. I have a few things coming up and—" "It's $900, Mom," she interrupted. "You said you just got your tax return." "I did," I said, "and I've allocated it already. I need to be responsible for myself now." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was sharp. Camille's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in contempt. She picked up the cup of tea I had poured for her when she arrived, the one still steaming softly on the counter, and in one swift motion, flung it at me. The liquid splashed across my chest and neck, not scalding but hot enough to sting. I gasped and stepped back, more shocked than burned. "You're unbelievable," she snapped. "You always act like a victim, but you hoard everything for yourself. I hope you enjoy your empty little house while Greg and I work our asses off trying to build something." And then she was gone. The door slammed. The wind rushed in through the briefly open threshold, and I stood there, soaked in tea, heart thudding, eyes stinging more from the betrayal than the heat. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stood in the middle of my kitchen, a space where I had once braided her hair while dinner simmered, and stared at the damp floor. The woman I had raised had just assaulted me, and all I could feel was a strange sense of resignation, as if the curtain had finally dropped and revealed what had been behind it all along. That was the moment the shift began. Not in Camille, but in me. For years, I had blamed myself for not being enough, for being too much, for speaking up, for staying quiet. I had excused her mood swings, her entitlement, her disappearances between holidays. But that morning, with tea dripping down my collarbone and the scent of lemon and betrayal in the air, I realized that love without boundaries is not love. It's submission. I spent the rest of the day in silence. I cleaned the counter. I changed my shirt. I stared at the photos on the mantel and wondered how a child raised in warmth could grow so cold. But I also made a decision. I would no longer let guilt write the checks my soul could not cash. Something had broken open inside me, not just from pain, but from clarity, and I was going to protect what remained of myself. What I didn't know then was that the coffee was just the beginning. Camille and Greg had plans, bigger ones that involved my house, my assets, my trust, and they were willing to manipulate, pressure, and even destroy what remained of our bond to get it. But I wasn't the same mother I had been a month ago. I wasn't the woman who answered the door with a smile and a cup of tea anymore, and when their real intentions surfaced, I would be ready. The next morning, I woke up to a text message from Camille. "Sorry, things got heated yesterday, but Greg and I really need you to reconsider." There was no mention of the coffee, no apology for throwing it, no remorse, no recognition. Just a casual, "things got heated." We'd simply disagreed over dinner choices, not crossed a line so deeply that it rattled the foundation of our relationship. I stared at the screen, the cold blue light of my phone reflecting off the walls of my bedroom, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. She didn't get it. Or worse, she didn't care. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to be cruel or hold some kind of petty grudge, but because for the first time in my life, I was learning the strength of silence. Not the kind of silence that waits to be coaxed, but the kind that sets a boundary and means it. I went downstairs, made my coffee, and looked out at the garden Clark and I had planted together the year before he passed. The roses were stubborn. They refused to bloom some years, no matter how well I cared for them. But this year, they'd come in fuller than ever, bright and unapologetically red. A little part of me smiled at that. Life, even when scorched and ignored, can sometimes surprise you with beauty when you least expect it. By the end of that week, I had 3 voicemails from Camille and 1 from Greg. His was curt, businesslike. "Hey, this is Greg. Look, it's really important that we have a conversation soon. Camille's been stressed, and I think you might be misinterpreting some things. Let's talk. Where to reach us?" I didn't call back. I didn't want to. Something in his voice, that calculated calm, felt like manipulation wrapped in politeness. It didn't take long for their need to resurface. The favor they had asked for, the flight to Tampa, was only the surface of what they were plotting. A week after the coffee incident, I received a typed envelope in the mail with a return address from an attorney's office in the city. At first, I assumed it was some kind of junk mail or real estate solicitation, but when I opened it, my breath caught. Inside was a letter stating that Camille and Greg were pursuing a cohabitation consolidation plan, which included a request to pre-transfer deed rights for the purpose of estate, simplification, and long-term familial security. In plain language, they were trying to get me to sign over my house. I reread the paragraph 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood, but the intention was clear. Hidden in the language of legalese and family unity was a bald request for control. My home, the house I'd built with Clark, the house I'd paid off over 30 years of careful budgeting, was now something they believed they were entitled to manage. Not because I offered, not because I was dying, but because they wanted it. And worse, they thought I would simply comply. That evening, I finally called Camille. When she answered, there was a lilt in her voice, the fake sweetness she used when she was trying to sound innocent. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. Did you get the letter? I know it probably looked all official and scary, but it's really just for ease. Greg's been learning about real estate strategy, and it makes sense for us to streamline things, especially since you're getting older and—" "Stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "Don't finish that sentence." There was a pause. I imagined her tilting her head, eyes wide, caught off guard that I wasn't playing along. "You think you can throw hot coffee at me, belittle me, then send a lawyer to try to take my home under the guise of strategy?" I asked, my words slow, deliberate. "Camille, I love you, but I don't trust you. Not anymore. And I won't be bullied into signing away the only thing I have left." She scoffed. "Mom, don't be dramatic. You're making it sound like we're villains. We're just trying to plan for the future." "No," I replied. "You're planning for your future. You haven't asked about mine." She hung up. That night, I pulled the old lockbox from the closet, the one where Clark and I had kept our wills, house papers, tax records. I sat at the kitchen table, cross-referencing dates, reading small print with tired eyes. I realized just how much power I still held. The house deed was in my name alone. My retirement account, while modest, was untouched. And the will Clark and I had written 10 years ago named Camille as sole heir. I stared at that final page for a long time. Camille, the girl who once left love notes on my pillow, who danced in the kitchen while I made dinner, had grown into a woman who weaponized kindness and leveraged guilt. And I had let her, because I wanted her to love me, because I thought sacrificing my peace was the price of motherhood. But love isn't supposed to come with invoices, not from your child, not when you've given them everything. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not the one Camille had sent, but someone of my choosing. Her name was Victoria, and she spoke to me like a human being, not a portfolio. Within 2 weeks, we began rewriting my will, organizing a trust, and securing the property under new conditions. Camille wouldn't know. Not yet. But when she tried again, and I knew she would, the walls would be in place. This time, she'd have no open doors to walk through. In the meantime, I went on living my life, quieter now, but with more control than I'd felt in years. I started volunteering at the local library again, helping with literacy workshops. I baked bread for the widow next door who'd recently fallen and broken her hip. I returned to myself, slowly, carefully, and with great reverence. Camille didn't speak to me for a month after that call. Not a single message, not even a hollow apology. Then one morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox, not from an attorney, from Camille herself. Written in her handwriting, which I hadn't seen in years. "Mom, I think we both said things we didn't mean. Greg is upset, but I told him we should try again. Maybe we come visit, just for dinner. Let's talk face to face." She signed it with a small heart beside her name, a relic from the past meant to disarm me. I held the letter in my hands for a long time. The invitation wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the timing. It arrived just a few days after the county assessor's office updated the deed status publicly. They must have seen the change, realized they couldn't move forward. Now they wanted a dinner. But I was no longer starving for their approval. I would invite them, yes. I'd even cook a meal. But what they didn't know was that dinner would not be the reunion they imagined. It would be the moment I showed them who I had become. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling fan, its blades cutting slow, silent circles above me as the echoes of Camille's voice replayed in my mind. The part that kept looping wasn't even the words, it was the look in her eyes, cold, calculating, as if I had suddenly become a roadblock instead of her mother. That's what hurt the most. Not the absurd request, not even the awkward tension at the dinner table, but that shift in her gaze. It was like I'd been reclassified, demoted, no longer worthy of consideration unless I offered something they needed. I rose early the next morning, even before the birds began to stir outside. The kitchen felt hollow as I made my tea. The quiet was different now, not peaceful like it used to be. It felt like abandonment, a soundless verdict. I sipped slowly, thinking, replaying every conversation from the past 6 months, every hint, every nudge, and how many of them I had ignored just to keep peace. I remembered the first time Greg had talked about consolidating family resources. It was just after their honeymoon, and I had dismissed it as newlywed enthusiasm. Then there was the time Camille asked if I had considered putting their names on the house deed just to make future paperwork easier. I had laughed it off, but now, with last night's incident, a pattern emerged, a pattern I could no longer ignore. Later that afternoon, I called my longtime friend Martha, someone who had known Camille since she was in diapers and had no problem telling me the truth. When I recounted what happened, there was a long pause on the line. "Oh, Ellen," she finally said, "I know you don't want to hear this, but that man has changed her. Camille used to be sharp, yes, but not like this. He's reworking how she sees you and your money." Her words landed like a cold slap. But they didn't hurt because they were unkind. They hurt because they were true. That weekend, Camille showed up at my door unannounced. Her makeup was flawless, her hair curled just the way Clark used to love. She wore the charm I remembered from her younger years, like it was a costume now. Deliberate, intentional. "Can we talk?" she asked. I let her in, nodding silently. We sat on the sofa, and for a moment she looked around like she was trying to memorize the space. "I just don't understand why you're being so stubborn," she said finally. "It's not like we're asking you to give away everything, just a simple credit line for Greg. He's really trying to get our business up and running." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "Camille, I worked hard for every dollar I saved. I stayed up late balancing ledgers while you slept down the hall. I didn't come this far to hand my trust over to someone who hasn't earned it." Her jaw clenched. "You don't trust Greg. You never have." "I don't trust people who see relationships as transactions." She stood abruptly, her tone turning icy. "You know what? Maybe it's time you learned how it feels to be unsupported." With that, she walked out. No hug, no goodbye. Just the click of her heels fading down the hall. Over the next 2 weeks, I didn't hear from her. No texts, no calls. I busied myself with baking, gardening, rereading old letters from Clark. I tried to stay ahead of the ache building in my chest, but some nights it would still come, quiet and relentless, like waves crashing against the shore of my ribs. Then came the incident. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I had gone into town to meet an old colleague for lunch. Afterward, I stopped by a local cafe to grab a scone for the next morning, and there they were, Camille and Greg, sitting at an outdoor table with 2 friends, laughing. I almost walked past unnoticed, but then Camille saw me. Her face changed immediately, cool, detached, but she waved me over. "Mom," she said, standing halfway. "Come say hello." I approached cautiously. Greg barely looked up. "This is my mother," Camille said to their friends, her tone light but distant. "She's the one holding up our business launch." The group chuckled, not knowing it wasn't a joke. My heart sank. "I was just picking up a scone," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Of course," Camille said. Then, without warning, she picked up her coffee cup and, in one smooth motion, tossed the contents across the table, hitting me square in the chest. I gasped, the heat shocking against my skin, the smell of bitter espresso saturating my blouse. There was a stunned silence. Even Greg looked alarmed. Camille didn't flinch. "Oh, sorry," she said flatly. My hand slipped. I stood there, drenched, humiliated, heart pounding, and then something inside me snapped. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't create a scene. I simply turned and walked away. Each step back to my car felt like it was lifting years off my shoulders, decades of swallowing pain, smoothing conflict, silencing myself for the sake of peace. It all began to unravel with each footstep. That night, I sat at my dining table with the deed to my house in front of me. It was still solely in my name. I pulled out my will, untouched since Clark passed, and began reviewing every clause. I poured myself a glass of wine, not to numb the pain, but to toast the clarity that coffee had burned into me. I would not be bullied, not by the daughter I raised, not by the man she married, and certainly not by guilt dressed as love, because real love doesn't come with a receipt. After that moment in the cafe, something fundamental inside me changed. It wasn't just about being disrespected publicly or feeling humiliated by my own child. It was the realization that I had allowed too much for far too long, all in the name of love, all in the name of motherhood. I had silenced my instincts, denied my boundaries, and tolerated a slow erosion of dignity for years, believing it was what mothers were supposed to do. But standing in front of my laundry sink that evening, scrubbing coffee stains out of my blouse, I found myself replaying not just what had happened at the cafe, but the 1,000 tiny moments that led up to it. Camille's subtle insults masked as concern, Greg's dismissive attitude, the way I was excluded from conversations unless my money was involved. I saw it all with perfect clarity now, as though someone had finally wiped the fog off the mirror. And I didn't want to play that role anymore. The quiet benefactor, the disposable matriarch, the woman they leaned on but never truly valued. That night, I pulled the deed from the fireproof box beneath my bed again. It was still there, untouched, all in my name, just like the house that I had helped Clark build with our bare hands over decades. Every floorboard, every curtain, every crack in the wall carried our story. It wasn't just property, it was memory. And I realized then that keeping it safe from Camille and Greg wasn't about revenge. It was about preservation. It was about ensuring that what Clark and I built with sweat and sacrifice didn't become a pawn in someone else's selfish game. I called my lawyer the next morning, a kind woman named Delaney whom I'd worked with before when we updated Clark's estate documents. She remembered me immediately and squeezed me in that afternoon. "I need to make some changes," I said, sitting across from her polished desk, the midday sun glowing behind me. "To the will, to the deed. And I need to set up a trust, something that protects the property long after I'm gone." Delaney's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Of course, Ellen," she said. "Let's get started." It took less than 2 hours to establish a living trust with stipulations that made it nearly impossible for Camille, or anyone else, to challenge. I appointed Martha as a backup executor and made provisions for a local women's shelter to inherit the property should Camille refuse reconciliation under conditions I would write in a sealed letter. It was drastic, but it gave me peace. By the time I left Delaney's office, the early signs of autumn had started to appear. The trees lining Main Street had softened from green to gold, and a crispness had crept into the breeze. It felt symbolic, like the turning of a personal season, one where I wasn't just surviving but reclaiming. For the next few weeks, Camille didn't reach out. Neither did Greg. There were no texts, no awkward apologies, no efforts to explain. But I wasn't surprised. They didn't need to maintain the illusion anymore. Once they realized I was no longer cooperating, I had outlived my usefulness in their eyes. And yet, part of me mourned the silence. I kept busy, volunteering at the library, baking for church events, helping Martha prep her garden for winter. But nothing filled that small, aching space where Camille's voice used to echo. I would hear the chime of my phone and reach for it, hoping it might be her, but it never was. Then one Friday afternoon, just as I was settling down with a book and a mug of cinnamon tea, there was a knock at the door. I opened it slowly, unsure of who to expect. And there she was, Camille, Her eyes were puffy and her arms were crossed, not out of defiance, but like she was holding herself together. "I just came to talk," she said softly. "May I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat on the couch where she used to nap as a child, right beneath the window that faced the lilac bushes. For a few minutes, we said nothing. She didn't even look at me. She just stared at the photograph of Clark that still hung above the fireplace. "I was wrong," she said finally. "About the card, about that day. I shouldn't have done what I did." I didn't speak. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I wanted to see if she was. "You always made things easy for me," she continued, "and I got used to it. Greg, he's under a lot of pressure, but that doesn't excuse how I treated you. I just thought, if we could have a little help, it would take the edge off. I didn't realize how much I was pushing." I looked at her then, really looked. The girl I raised was still in there somewhere, beneath the tired eyes and brittle defensiveness. But I didn't know if trust could be rebuilt on apology alone. Not when actions had spoken louder than words for so long. "I'm not angry," I said, my voice calm. "But I'm not a bottomless well either. Love doesn't mean emptying myself so others can stay full." She wiped at her eyes, nodding. "I understand," she whispered. "I just wanted you to know, I do love you, Mom. I've just been too stupid to show it right." There was a pause, long enough for the air between us to shift. "I believe you," I said. "But believing isn't the same as forgetting." She stayed a little longer and we talked, cautiously navigating a fragile peace. I didn't offer her money. She didn't ask. And when she left, there was no hug, just a quiet, "Thank you for letting me in." That night, I stood in front of Clark's photo and whispered, "I hope you're proud of how I handled it." Because I hadn't screamed, hadn't lashed out, hadn't taken the bait to become bitter. I had simply protected what mattered, my home, my heart, and the history Clark and I had built with quiet strength. But as much as Camille's apology mattered, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. Because sometimes, peace isn't a final chapter. It's just an interlude before the storm comes back around. I had thought the storm had passed, that Camille's visit, her quiet remorse, was the beginning of healing. But life doesn't tie itself up in neat little bows, especially when damage runs deep and expectations are shaped more by need than by love. The illusion of peace has a way of lulling you into vulnerability, and when I let my guard down, I did so because I wanted to believe in the best parts of my daughter. But believing in someone's potential is not the same as accepting their patterns. It was nearly 6 weeks after her visit that the next wave hit. The phone call came late one afternoon as golden October sunlight stretched through my living room like honey. I had been dusting the bookshelf, gently cleaning the framed photo of Clark and me on our wedding day. I still spoke to him sometimes, told him about the weather or about the casserole I'd tried from the church newsletter. His silence didn't make me feel alone. It made me feel accompanied. When the phone rang, I picked it up with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Maybe Camille wanted to meet for coffee. Maybe she was finally ready to rebuild something real, brick by careful brick. But it wasn't Camille. It was Greg. His voice was clipped, falsely cordial. "Ellen, hope you're well." There was no warmth in his greeting, no acknowledgement of what had passed between us. "I'm fine, Greg," I said, my tone guarded. "What can I do for you?" "I'm calling about the house," he said. "Camille mentioned you had made some changes to the will. She's concerned." I paused. "Is that so?" "Yes. She said something about a trust, about donations to a charity, instead of the family." I stepped over to the window, watching leaves skitter across the sidewalk like tiny golden boats. "That's correct," I said evenly. "Ellen," he continued, his voice lowering, "you have to understand how that sounds. You're essentially threatening to disinherit your only daughter. Over what? A misunderstanding at a cafe?" His words were deliberate, calculated. The kind of phrasing that reframes harm as innocence and resistance as irrationality. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said. "I'm protecting what Clark and I built, and as for the cafe incident, I'd suggest you revisit the full context before calling it a misunderstanding." There was a pause. He sighed. "Look, I don't want to get into a fight. I'm just saying, think about the future. One day, you'll be gone, and Camille will be left wondering why her own mother turned against her." I bristled. If Camille wants to know why, she can reflect on her own actions. I haven't closed the door, but I won't leave it wide open for more abuse either. We ended the call with no resolution, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't cry after hanging up. I didn't second-guess myself. I sat down on the couch, poured myself a cup of tea, and watched the light change through the window. A week later, I received a letter. Thick envelope, expensive paper, formal letterhead. It was from a law office. Camille and Greg were contesting my estate arrangements. I stared at the words, rereading the lines where my daughter claimed I was of declining mental capacity, where she alleged undue influence by external parties, meaning most likely Martha, and where she requested the court to re-examine my legal documentation on the grounds of family interest. I felt like the air had been knocked from my chest. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about control, about erasing my autonomy, my choices, and reducing me to a signature on a check. The betrayal stung more than the cafe, more than the silence. This was war, disguised in legal language, wrapped in family ties, and delivered like a blow to the soul. I called Delaney immediately. "Don't worry," she said, her voice calm. "Their claims won't hold. You are of sound mind. Everything was recorded, documented, witnessed. We'll respond." But it wasn't the legal part that kept me up that night. It was the emotional rupture. I thought I had already lost my daughter, but this felt like losing her twice. For days, I moved through my house like a ghost, caught between anger and grief, between resolve and exhaustion. Martha came over with muffins and gentle hands, but even she could see the fire dimming in me. Then one evening, as I sat on the porch wrapped in Clark's old cardigan, watching the last of the autumn leaves flutter from the trees, I realized something. Camille may have initiated the legal challenge, but she had no power to rewrite my story. I did, so I began writing a letter. Not a legal response, not a rebuttal to her accusations, but a letter from mother to daughter. I poured out everything, the memories of her first steps, the night she called me from college crying over her first heartbreak, the joy I felt watching her walk down the aisle, the pain I felt when she turned away from me. I wrote about love, how it endures, but also demands respect. I wrote about boundaries, about forgiveness, about the kind of legacy I wanted to leave, not just in property, but in truth. I sealed the letter and placed it in a locked drawer with instructions for Martha to deliver it one day, if needed. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced, alone, barefoot, in the kitchen. I played an old record, the kind Clark and I used to waltz to after dinner, and I let my feet move across the tiles, tears streaming down my face, not from sorrow, but from reclamation. I had been bruised, yes, but not broken, and whatever came next, whether courtroom or silence, I would face it not as a burden, not as a villain in someone else's narrative, but as a woman who had lived, loved, and finally learned to stand tall. I had always thought that growing older would bring a kind of soft wisdom, like the quiet blooming of lavender at the edge of summer. That pain would somehow distill into grace. That time would temper the fire of old wounds into warm embers of memory. But as I sat across from my lawyer one final time, documents signed, plans laid bare, I realized something else about aging. Sometimes growing older doesn't make you softer. It makes you clearer, sharper. It burns away the illusions. Greg and Camille didn't respond to the letter I sent. Not the legal one from Delaney's office, not the handwritten one from my heart. Silence filled the space where reconciliation could have lived, and I let that silence echo without trying to fill it. There was nothing left to say. I had already spoken my truth, and unlike before, I didn't need their validation to believe it. The legal dispute didn't last long. Delaney's preparation had been impeccable. My doctors confirmed my mental health was stable and strong. My witnesses affirmed there was no external coercion. My paperwork, solid. Greg's attempt to frame me as confused or emotionally unstable failed before it reached the courtroom. His plan had crumbled under the weight of my preparation and, perhaps, his own arrogance. When it ended, there was no apology, just an absence. I stopped receiving messages. My phone grew quieter. The only sound I heard from their end was the occasional neighborhood whisper. Someone who'd seen Camille at a fundraiser, who mentioned her strained expression, the way her voice wavered when my name came up. That was all I needed to know. Sometimes guilt doesn't come with a confession. It comes with a quiet shift in how someone walks through the world. With the house now in a protected trust and a portion of the estate directed toward a scholarship fund in Clark's name, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Not the joyful kind, but the earned kind. The peace that comes after surviving your own child's rejection and still choosing not to become bitter. Martha and I celebrated in our own way. She brought over a pie, peach and cinnamon, our favorite, and we sat on the porch under the late autumn sky. "You look lighter," she said as I leaned back in my chair. "I think I am," I told her, not because they apologized, but because I stopped waiting for them to. It wasn't a grand moment of victory. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, grounded, like watching the last leaf fall from a tree and knowing, finally, that winter is just another season, not an ending. I began spending my mornings walking through the neighborhood. I passed the bakery where Clark used to pick up sticky buns on Sundays. I waved at the children walking to school. I even started volunteering at the local library, helping shelve books and guide curious eyes to stories that might shape them. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt real. One afternoon, as I was walking past the community center bulletin board, I saw a small flyer pinned crookedly beneath an ad for piano lessons. It read, "Grandparents' Story Time. Volunteers Needed." Without hesitating, I pulled one of the tabs. 2 weeks later, I sat in a room of toddlers and their exhausted but grateful parents, reading stories about animals and adventure. They listened with open faces, their joy unfiltered, their laughter genuine. And there, in that tiny circle of innocence, I rediscovered something I thought I'd lost, my ability to nurture, to give, to connect, without needing anything in return. The weight that had clung to my shoulders for so long, regret, confusion, betrayal, began to melt, not because my daughter came back, but because I stopped shrinking myself to fit the spaces she left behind. I began to live again. Not the life I had once planned, full of family dinners and photos on the mantel, but a life that belonged to me, full of new rituals, fresh friendships, and the quiet power of boundaries honored. And sometimes I still thought of her, of Camille, not with bitterness, but with a strange tenderness that comes from knowing someone so completely and losing them anyway. I sent her cards on holidays, short ones, just a line or two, no expectations, just a light left on in case she ever wanted to come home. Whether she ever would, I didn't know, but I was no longer standing at the window waiting. Instead, I was walking towards something new. And if you're still listening, from wherever you are in this world, I just want to say thank you for letting me share this with you. If you've ever felt unseen, unvalued, or pushed aside by someone you love, I hope my story helps you feel a little less alone. You are not forgotten. You are not finished. You still hold power in your voice, your choices, your truth. If this touched you, I invite you, softly, with no pressure, to subscribe for more stories like this one. Leave a comment if you'd like to share something of your own, or simply let me know where in the world you're listening from. Maybe we're not as far apart as we think. This is Ellen, signing off for now. Until next time, stay kind to your heart and don't let anyone take your peace.